For years, the Bank of Japan had a problem with low economic growth and low inflation. In the mid-80s, the Plaza Accord led to a rapid rise in the yen. So the BOJ, the Bank of Japan, eased their monetary policy. This eventually led to a housing bubble, and when they pivoted to tighter policy, the bubble spectacularly popped in the early 90s. The economy imploded, became stagnant, and then came deflation. Several key events have happened since then. The BOJ became independent, they dropped interest rates to 0% and experimented with quantitative easing, QE, but nothing seemed to work. Then in 2013, Kuroda became the new governor. He wanted to end deflation once and for all. There was more QE, he even adopted negative interest rates, and then around 2016, they started using yield curve control. Yield curves show the rates on bonds across different durations. If you wanted to buy a bond, you could look at the yield curve to see what the interest rates would be along different time horizons. Now, the curve is usually upwards. It starts low as near-term bonds typically pay less interest, and it gets higher towards the longer term. It doesn't always look like this. We can have flat or inverted curves, but this is more normal. Now, government bonds are usually considered the safest assets, as governments usually repay their debts, at least in major economies. This means they generally pay a low level of interest, and that makes them a key gauge for other interest rates in the economy. So changes in interest rates for government bonds result in changes in interest rates for other things as well. Things like mortgages, consumer loans, business loans, savings accounts, and so on. Now, bond prices and bond yields are inversely correlated. As the price of a bond increases, the yield goes down, and if the bond price decreases, the yield goes up. So, in theory, all the Bank of Japan has to do is purchase massive amounts of certain government bonds, and this creates huge demand for them, leading to the price increasing, which drives down the yield, and it could cause the yield curve to become a bit more flat. So, if they focus on targeting 10-year bonds, that's a decent time horizon for keeping long-term rates down, and if you combine that with negative interest rates, which impact short-term rates more, it should add a lot of pressure to keep rates low throughout the economy. Now, you might be thinking, well, the Federal Reserve, the ECB and the Bank of England have also purchased ridiculous amounts of bonds, so what's different here? And yeah, it does sound similar to normal quantitative easing, where central banks buy government bonds. But with yield curve control, the Bank of Japan targets a specific yield or a range to keep rates at. Those other central banks didn't set such explicit duration targets, at least not publicly anyway. They just bought whatever they needed to bump up the economy. So this target, or range, is known as the band. So let's say they have a target of 0% yields on 10-year government debt. If they have a band of 25 basis points, it means they will allow the yield to fluctuate between 0.25% and minus 0.25%. If the yield hits 0.25%, their money printer will kick in and they'll load up on more bonds to drive it back down again. That example represents a fairly tight band of just 25 basis points, but a wider band could be 50 basis points. And a wider limit is seen as being more on the tightening side because it shows that the central bank is willing to let bond yields run higher, so they don't need to buy as many bonds. But recently, things changed in Japan. Kuroda retired earlier this year, and the new governor, Ueda, took over. There was speculation that he was going to overhaul the policy at the bank as inflation was finally back. We haven't seen many major changes yet, and it's likely they don't want to rush into things and risk deflation coming back again, but they are beginning to tweak their yield curve control with a wider band and less aggressive wording in their statements. Last year, the BOJ was pretty aggressive when it came to defending the yield cap. They were more open to purchasing unlimited bonds to keep it within their band, but recently they changed this. Rather than the band being this rigid limit, it would now serve as more of a reference point. Now, that's less aggressive wording, and relatively small things like this matter when it comes to central bank statements. They also said that they would allow the band to widen to 100 basis points, meaning yields on 10-year bonds can now fluctuate up to 1%. It's the same sort of thing as tapering the amount of bond purchases. Allowing it to fluctuate higher means they don't need to purchase as many bonds. It is still loose monetary policy, but it's a bit less loose. If they just removed the band altogether, effectively ending their yield curve control, it would have a similar effect to hiking interest rates, which they aren't ready for yet. They want more evidence that inflation is there to stay first, likely through things like higher wages. But by moving slowly, if long-term rates do spike, they can use yield curve control to buy tons of bonds and bring them back down again, sort of like a fail-safe in case things go wrong. Now, part of the reason that they chose to loosen up could be due to the yen's exchange rate. The yen is relatively weak against the US dollar at the moment. If we look at dollar yen, it's near the highest levels in around 20 years and still climbing. That hurts Japanese consumers as it costs them more money to import stuff, and according to some reports, Japan isn't comfortable with currency intervention at the moment. So by letting the yield curve increase and hinting that they won't be so aggressive in defending the band, it may result in longer term interest rates increasing as bond yields increase, which could create more demand for the yen. Obviously, there are always two sides to every currency pair, and the US is also still tightening their policy. So shorter term, it may mean that the yen loses value slightly slower rather than reversing completely. But unlike the Bank of Japan, the Federal Reserve, the ECB and other major central banks are nearing the end of their tightening cycle, whereas the Bank of Japan may just be getting started.